There is a specific kind of commercial intelligence that operates beneath the surface of cultural production, invisible to the audience that consumes the product, but legible to anyone who understands the economic structures that produce the conditions under which art is funded, distributed, and consumed. This intelligence is not artistic. It is not moral. It is not even, in the conventional sense, strategic, because strategy implies a conscious plan executed by identifiable agents toward identifiable goals. What operates beneath the surface of A24's release of The Drama in April of 2026 is something more structural, more impersonal, and more consequential than any individual strategy. It is the logic of capital accumulation applied to the domain of cultural meaning, the systematic conversion of human emotional experience into a commodity that can be extracted, packaged, and sold at scale. And the specific emotional experience that The Drama extracts, the experience of moral crisis, of confronting information that destabilizes your understanding of the people you love and the world you inhabit, is not an incidental byproduct of the film's narrative. It is the product. It is what A24 is selling. And understanding how this product was engineered requires a framework that draws simultaneously from Pierre Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital and symbolic violence, from Shoshana Zuboff's analysis of surveillance capitalism and the extraction of behavioral surplus, from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's prospect theory and its implications for how human beings process losses relative to gains, from the neuroscientific research on dopamine, prediction error, and the brain's reward circuitry, and from the Frankfurt School's foundational critique of the culture industry as a mechanism for producing subjects who are complicit in their own domination. Begin with the neuroscience, because the neuroscience is where the commercial logic originates, even if the commercial actors themselves do not understand their operations in these terms. The human brain's reward system, the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, running from the ventral tegmental area through the nucleus accumbens to the prefrontal cortex, does not respond primarily to pleasure. It responds to prediction error, to the gap between what the brain expects and what the brain receives. When a prediction is confirmed, the dopamine response is modest. When a prediction is violated, when the brain encounters something unexpected, something that does not fit its model of the world, the dopamine response is massive, producing a surge of attention, arousal, and engagement that the neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz, in his foundational 1997 paper on dopamine neurons and reward prediction, demonstrated to be the brain's primary mechanism for learning, for updating its model of the world, for prioritizing the information that is most likely to be relevant to survival. This prediction error mechanism is not merely a neurological curiosity. It is the engine that drives the entire attention economy, because content that violates predictions, content that is surprising, transgressive, dissonant, unexpected, produces larger dopamine responses than content that confirms predictions. And larger dopamine responses produce longer attention, deeper engagement, more vigorous sharing, and more intense emotional investment. The attention economy is, at its neurological foundation, a prediction error economy. And A24's marketing campaign for The Drama is the most precisely engineered prediction error machine that the entertainment industry has ever produced. The prediction error structure of the campaign operates on multiple nested levels, each one designed to produce a specific type of violation at a specific moment in the audience's engagement with the product. The first level is the fake engagement announcement in the Boston Globe, a prediction violation that operates at the level of reality itself. The audience encounters what appears to be a real engagement announcement and processes it as real. The dopamine response is minimal because the prediction, engagement announcements are real, is confirmed. But when A24 reveals the announcement to be fictional, the prediction is retroactively violated. The audience discovers that the reality they processed was not reality, but simulation, that their emotional response was not spontaneous, but engineered, that the engagement they felt was not with a real couple, but with a marketing product. This retroactive violation produces a delayed dopamine surge, a prediction error response that is experienced not as the mild surprise of encountering something unexpected, but as the profound destabilization of discovering that your perceptual apparatus itself cannot be trusted. The announcement was real. No, it was fake, but you felt it as real. So what else that you feel is real might also be fake? This cascade of epistemological doubt is not a side effect of the campaign. It is the campaign's intended product, because epistemological doubt is the most engaging cognitive state that a human being can experience, more engaging than certainty, more engaging than curiosity, more engaging than fear. The brain cannot rest in a state of epistemological doubt. It must resolve the doubt, must determine what is real and what is not, must update its model of the world to account for the new information. And this compulsive drive toward resolution, this neurological inability to tolerate unresolved prediction error, is what keeps the audience engaged with the product long after the initial stimulus has been consumed. The audience does not stop thinking about the drama when the credits roll. The audience cannot stop thinking about the drama because the drama has engineered a prediction error that cannot be fully resolved, a question that cannot be definitively answered, a moral crisis that cannot be settled. And as long as the prediction error remains unresolved, the dopamine system keeps firing, the attention keeps flowing, and the product keeps generating value. The second level of prediction error is the film's genre violation, the gap between the romantic comedy that the marketing promises and the moral thriller that the film delivers. This violation operates at the level of narrative expectation, and it is calibrated with a precision that suggests either extraordinary artistic intuition or extraordinary commercial calculation, or, most likely, both. The audience enters the theater expecting a romantic comedy, a genre defined by what the literary theorist Stanley Cavell, in Pursuits of Happiness, identified as the comedy of remarriage, in which a couple that has been separated by misunderstanding or circumstance is reunited through mutual recognition and renewed commitment. The romantic comedy is the most reassuring of all narrative forms because it promises that love will survive whatever obstacles the plot introduces, that the couple will end up together, that the world is fundamentally benign, and that human relationships are fundamentally resilient. The drama initially satisfies this expectation: the meet cute in the coffee shop, the first dance rehearsal, the speech preparation, the food tasting, and then violates it with such violence that the violation itself becomes the subject. Emma's confession is not a romantic comedy obstacle. It is a category error, a piece of information that belongs to a different genre entirely, a genre defined not by reassurance but by dread, not by the resilience of love but by the fragility of identity, not by the promise that everything will be okay, but by the possibility that nothing will ever be okay again. The prediction error that this genre violation produces is not merely cognitive, it is somatic. The audience's body responds: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension, the physiological signatures of threat detection that the neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux documented in The Emotional Brain as the amygdala's rapid, unconscious assessment of danger. The audience came to the theater to feel warm. The audience feels threatened. And the gap between warmth and threat, the prediction error between the expected emotion and the received emotion, is the most powerful engagement mechanism available to a cultural product because it hijacks the brain's survival circuitry, converting a leisure activity into a simulated emergency that the brain cannot ignore. The third level of prediction error is the moral violation, the gap between the audience's moral expectations and the moral reality that the film presents. The audience expects that a school shooter is a monster. Emma is not a monster. She is Zendaya, warm, beautiful, funny, empathetic, the opposite of everything the audience associates with mass violence. The prediction error is categorical. The category school shooter and the category Zendaya are mutually exclusive in the audience's cognitive architecture, and the film forces them to coexist, producing a prediction error that cannot be resolved through any of the standard cognitive strategies that the brain deploys to manage contradictory information. The brain cannot dismiss the information because the source, the film itself, confirmed by the character's own confession, is authoritative. The brain cannot reinterpret the information because the confession is unambiguous. Emma planned a school shooting, acquired a weapon, brought it to school. The brain cannot rationalize the information because the moral stakes are too high. Mass violence is not a domain in which rationalization feels acceptable. The only remaining strategy is what the cognitive psychologist Jean Piaget called accommodation, the restructuring of the brain's existing cognitive schemas to incorporate the new information. But accommodation requires the destruction of the existing schema, and the existing schema, people I love are incapable of mass violence, is one of the foundational structures of social trust, one of the basic assumptions that makes intimate relationships possible. To accommodate Emma's confession is to destroy this assumption. To destroy this assumption is to accept that any person, your partner, your friend, your child, yourself, might be capable of the unthinkable. The prediction error that the film produces is not resolved by the film's narrative. It is released into the audience's life, where it continues to generate engagement in the form of conversations, arguments, social media posts, think pieces, and the slow, corrosive work of doubt that operates beneath consciousness, and that manifests as the vague, persistent unease that viewers report experiencing for days or weeks after seeing the film. Now layer the commercial logic onto this neuroscientific foundation, because the commercial logic is what transforms the prediction error from an artistic effect into an extraction mechanism. A24 is a corporation. Its revenues in 2025 were estimated at over $300 million. It was valued, following its 2023 minority stake sale to Eldridge Industries, at approximately $2.5 billion. Its investors, Eldridge, founded by the financier Todd Boehly, who also owns the Los Angeles Dodgers and has major investments in sports, media, and entertainment, expect returns. These returns are generated not by making art, but by making products that generate revenue, and the revenue that A24's products generate is a function of the attention they capture, the conversation they produce, and the cultural capital they confer on the people who consume them. The drama is designed, at every level of its conception, production, marketing, and distribution, to maximize all three of these value streams. The attention is captured through the prediction error mechanism described above. The conversation is produced through the moral crisis that the prediction error generates, a crisis that is by design unresolvable because an unresolvable crisis produces infinite conversation, while a resolvable crisis produces a single answer and then silence. And the cultural capital is conferred through the film's positioning as a serious, challenging, intellectually demanding work of art that separates its audience from the mass of uncritical consumers, a positioning that is maintained by the film's association with A24's brand, with Christopher Borgli's auteur credentials, with Ari Aster's production involvement, and with the discourse of moral complexity and artistic ambition that surrounds the film in critical and social media. Bourdieu's framework is essential here because it identifies the mechanism through which cultural capital is converted into economic capital, the mechanism that makes A24's entire business model possible. Bourdieu argued that cultural capital, the knowledge, taste, and aesthetic dispositions that confer social status, operates as a form of currency that can be exchanged for economic capital through specific institutional channels. A college degree is cultural capital that is exchanged for a salary. A prestigious address is cultural capital that is exchanged for social access, and a sophisticated film is cultural capital that is exchanged for a ticket purchase, a transaction in which the buyer acquires not just a movie, but a social position, a claim to distinction, a visible marker of taste that can be deployed in subsequent social interactions. When a person says, "I saw the drama" at a dinner party, they are not reporting a fact. They are performing a claim to cultural sophistication, to moral seriousness, to the kind of engaged, thoughtful, aesthetically sensitive subjectivity that the upper middle class professional world rewards with status, opportunity, and belonging. A24 understood this mechanism from its founding. The studio's early marketing strategy, low-cost digital marketing, social media memes, the cultivation of a visual aesthetic that signified indie credibility, was designed to produce cultural capital for its audience at minimal cost. But the strategy has evolved. The drama represents its most mature expression, a product that generates cultural capital not through aesthetic pleasure, but through moral crisis, not through the satisfaction of seeing a beautiful film, but through the disturbance of confronting an unanswerable question. The cultural capital that the drama confers is not the capital of good taste. It is the capital of moral seriousness, the capital that accrues to a person who has engaged with a difficult topic and emerged, not with an answer, but with the visible evidence of having struggled. This struggle, visible in the conversations, the think pieces, the social media posts, the heated arguments at brunch, is the product. A24 sells the struggle. The audience buys the struggle, and the struggle never ends because the question never resolves, because the question was designed not to be resolved, but to be struggled with, indefinitely, productively, profitably. The Frankfurt School's critique of the culture industry provides the final, darkest layer of this analysis. Adorno and Horkheimer argued that the culture industry does not merely produce entertainment, it produces subjects, human beings who have been trained through their consumption of standardized cultural products to accept the social order as natural, to experience their subordination as freedom, and to desire the very products that sustain their subordination. The culture industry does not repress, it co-opts. It takes the genuine human need for meaning, beauty, and connection and converts it into a need for commodities, redirecting the energy that might otherwise be directed towards social transformation into the energy of consumption. A24's version of this co-optation is more sophisticated than anything Adorno and Horkheimer imagined, because A24 does not produce conformist entertainment that pacifies the audience. A24 produces critical entertainment that activates the audience, entertainment that provokes thought, that generates debate, that makes the audience feel that it is participating in a meaningful cultural conversation. But the participation is itself the product. The thought is itself the commodity. The debate is itself the mechanism of co-optation, because the debate absorbs the energy that the audience might otherwise direct toward the actual problems that the film depicts: the epidemic of mass shootings, the failure of gun control policy, the racial dynamics of violence and forgiveness, the structural conditions that produce radicalized teenagers, and redirects that energy into the consumption of A24's product. The audience debates the drama. The audience does not debate gun policy. The audience writes think pieces about Zendaya's casting. The audience does not write letters to their senators. The audience posts on social media about the moral complexity of loving someone with a violent past. The audience does not organize, does not protest, does not demand the structural changes that would prevent the next Emma Harwood from picking up her father's rifle. The conversation replaces the action, the product replaces the politics, and A24 collects the revenue that the replacement generates, investing it in the next product, which will generate the next conversation, which will replace the next politics, in a cycle that is self-sustaining, self-justifying, and, from the perspective of the social order that it perpetuates, self-serving. This is not a conspiracy theory. A24 does not sit in a boardroom and plan to neutralize political action through cultural production. The mechanism is structural, not intentional. It operates through the logic of the market, the logic that says the most profitable cultural product is the one that generates the most attention, and the product that generates the most attention is the one that addresses the most urgent social problems without providing any means of solving them. A film that solved the gun violence problem would generate a single conversation. The problem has been solved. A film that raises the gun violence problem as an unresolvable moral dilemma generates infinite conversation. What would you do? Is forgiveness possible? Can love survive? Where do you draw the line? These questions are inexhaustible. They have no answers. They generate engagement without resolution, conversation without conclusion, cultural capital without political consequence. They are, in the language of the systems theorist Niklas Luhmann, communicatively productive. They reproduce themselves through communication, generating ever more communication without ever arriving at a terminus. And this communicative productivity, this capacity to generate infinite conversation from a single premise, is the quality that makes the drama. A24's most perfectly engineered product, a film that converts America's most devastating social crisis into a renewable source of cultural engagement, extracting value from suffering without ever threatening to alleviate it. Consider the specific financial architecture. The drama was produced for approximately $28 million, a budget that, for a film starring Zendaya and Robert Pattinson, is remarkably modest. Zendaya's market rate, based on her work in Challengers and the Dune franchise, is estimated at $8 to $12 million per film. Pattinson's rate, based on the Batman and the Nolan franchise, is comparable. If we assume that star salaries consumed approximately 15 to 20 million of the budget, the remaining $8 to $13 million covered everything else: production design, cinematography, the supporting cast, Daniel Pemberton's score, location shooting in Boston, New York, New Orleans, and Los Angeles. This budget efficiency is itself a form of commercial intelligence. A24 understood that the film's value would be generated not by production spectacle, but by conversation, by the cultural capital that the moral dilemma produces, by the think pieces and the social media posts and the arguments at dinner parties. You do not need expensive visual effects to generate conversation. You need a premise that people cannot stop talking about. And A24 acquired this premise for the cost of a screenplay, a document that contains, in approximately 120 pages, the most efficient conversation-generating mechanism in the history of American cinema. A beautiful woman, played by the most beloved actress of her generation, confesses to planning a school shooting, and everyone in the audience must decide what they think about it. The cost of this mechanism is negligible. The revenue it generates, $14 million in the opening weekend alone, with global projections exceeding $100 million, is extraordinary. The return on investment is not measured in percentage points. It is measured in orders of magnitude. And the efficiency of this return, the ratio of investment to revenue, of cost to conversation, of capital expended to cultural capital produced, is the metric by which A24's commercial intelligence should be evaluated, not as art, not as politics, not as morality, as engineering, as the engineering of attention, of conversation, of moral crisis, and of the revenue that moral crisis generates in a society that has lost the capacity to resolve its crises and has learned instead to consume them. Christopher Borgli wrote Emma Harwood as a white woman. This is not speculation. It is confirmed fact, reported by Refinery29 in their post-release analysis with a specificity that leaves no room for ambiguity. Borgli initially wrote Emma as white in his script, but as soon as Zendaya was cast, the character and the entire movie changed. The phrasing is precise, and the precision matters. The character changed, and the entire movie changed. But what exactly changed? The answer, when you examine the film with the analytical tools that the question demands, tools drawn from Saidiya Hartman's theorization of black fungibility and the afterlife of slavery, from Cheryl Harris's Harvard Law Review article on whiteness as property, from Hortense Spiller's foundational essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, on the distinction between body and flesh in the grammar of American racial domination, from Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark and its analysis of the Africanist presence in white American literature, and from Shirley Ann Tate's work on black women's desirability as a site of simultaneous fetishization and threat, the answer is almost nothing. And the almost nothing that changed is the most revealing thing about the film, because it exposes the mechanism by which contemporary Hollywood processes racial difference, not through engagement, but through absorption, not through analysis, but through erasure, not through the difficult work of imagining a character whose racial identity shapes her experience of the world, but through the effortless work of attaching a non-white body to a white character's story and calling the result representation. Consider, with the rigor that the question demands, what a racially conscious version of Emma's story would look like, what the film would have been if Borgli had not merely changed the casting, but rewritten the character to reflect the specific experience of a biracial black girl growing up in the American South in the early 2010s. Emma's family is military, her father is in the armed forces. The family relocates constantly. They settle in Louisiana when Emma is 14. She is bullied. She is isolated. She finds community online. She is radicalized by the aesthetics of mass violence. She acquires her father's rifle. She practices shooting in the woods. She rehearses a manifesto. She brings the weapon to school. She does not go through with the shooting. She moves to Boston, reinvents herself, and becomes the woman Charlie falls in love with. Every element of this story has a racial dimension that the film systematically suppresses. The military, the United States Armed Forces, have a complex and well-documented racial history, from segregation through integration, through the contemporary reality in which Black Americans are overrepresented in the enlisted ranks and underrepresented in the officer corps, and in which military service functions as one of the primary mechanisms of economic mobility for Black families who are excluded from the civilian pathways: higher education, professional networking, intergenerational wealth transfer that white families use to reproduce their class position. Emma's father's military service is not racially neutral. It positions the family within a specific racial economic structure, a structure in which military service is both a source of stability, steady income, healthcare, housing, and a source of displacement, constant relocation, disrupted social bonds, the subordination of family needs to institutional demands. For a biracial family, this displacement has racial consequences that a white family would not experience. Each new posting places the family in a new racial environment, requiring the negotiation of new racial hierarchies, new racial expectations, new forms of racial visibility and invisibility. A biracial girl who moves from a relatively diverse military community to a predominantly white Louisiana town at age 14 is not merely changing schools. She is entering a racial minefield, a social landscape in which her body is read differently by every person she encounters, in which her racial identity is a constant subject of scrutiny, curiosity, hostility, and fetishization, and in which the social isolation she experiences is not the generic isolation of the new kid, but the specific, racially charged isolation of the body that does not fit. The bullying that Emma describes in the transcript, ever heard of deodorant and bitch and shit like that, is presented as generic adolescent cruelty, the kind of thing that any new student might experience. But for a biracial Black girl in a Louisiana school, these insults would have racial content that the film completely erases. The deodorant comment, in particular, resonates with a specific history of anti-Black racial stereotyping, the association of Black bodies with uncleanliness, with excessive physicality, with a bodily presence that is constructed as offensive to white sensory norms. This stereotype has been documented by scholars from Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, to Imani Perry in Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, as one of the foundational mechanisms of anti-Black racism, a mechanism that operates not through explicit ideological assertion, but through the sensory register, through the construction of Black bodies as bodies that smell wrong, that look wrong, that take up space wrong, that offend the white sensorium by their mere presence. The deodorant comment is not a generic insult. It is a racial weapon, a microaggression that communicates, with devastating efficiency, that Emma's body is unwelcome, that her physical presence violates the sensory norms of the social space she occupies, that she is, in the most literal sense, out of place. And the film's failure to register this racial content, its presentation of the insult as generic rather than specific, as adolescent rather than racial, is not an oversight. It is a structural feature of the film's racial architecture, the architecture of erasure, of absorption, of the conversion of racially specific experience into racially generic narrative. The online radicalization is where the racial erasure becomes most analytically devastating, because the online communities that aestheticize mass violence, the communities that Emma describes as a whole thing online, the communities where she found the aesthetics of mass shootings cool, are overwhelmingly white communities. They are organized around ideologies of white grievance, white victimhood, and white masculine entitlement. The scholars who have studied these communities most rigorously, Kathleen Belew in Bring the War Home, Jesse Daniels in Cyber Racism, Angela Nagel in Kill All Normies, and the researchers at the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League who track online extremism have documented that these communities are not racially neutral spaces. They are white spaces, spaces defined by the exclusion of non-white people, by the celebration of white identity, by the construction of non-white people as threats to be eliminated or subordinated. A biracial Black girl entering these spaces would not simply be another user consuming content. She would be an intruder, a body that the community's ideology defines as the enemy, a person whose racial identity places her in fundamental contradiction with the ideological framework of the content she is consuming. The fact that Emma found belonging in these communities, that she was intrigued by their aesthetics, that she identified with the shooter persona, that she wanted to participate in the genre, raises questions that the film does not merely fail to answer, but fails to ask. How does a biracial Black girl identify with a white supremacist aesthetic? What does it mean for a person whose body is targeted by the ideology to adopt that ideology as her own? What kind of self-alienation, What kind of racial dissociation? What kind of psychic violence is required for a black girl to look at images of white boys shooting up schools and think, that looks cool, I want to do that? These questions are not peripheral to Emma's story. They are the story, the most psychologically complex, most politically charged, most analytically productive dimension of her character. And the film has nothing to say about them because the film was written for a white character, and when the character became biracial, no one, not Borgli, not A24, not Ari Aster, not the producers, not the development executives, thought to rewrite the story to account for the racial identity of the person telling it. Hortense Spiller's distinction between body and flesh, articulated in her 1987 essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, provides the theoretical framework that this analysis requires. Spillers argued that the Atlantic slave trade created a fundamental distinction in American culture between the body, which is a socially constructed entity that carries gender, identity, and social position, and the flesh, which is the pre-social, pre-cultural materiality of the human organism, the raw physical substrate that exists before and beneath social meaning. The slave trade, Spillers argued, reduced black people from bodies to flesh, stripped them of their social identities, their gender positions, their cultural affiliations, and converted them into undifferentiated material that could be bought, sold, branded, bred, and consumed. This reduction from body to flesh is, Spillers argued, the foundational violence of American racial domination, and its effects persist in the contemporary treatment of black people as interchangeable, as fungible, as available to be inserted into any social position, any narrative, any representational framework, without the need to account for their specific identity, their specific history, their specific experience of the world. The drama treats Zendaya's body as flesh in precisely Spiller's sense. It strips the body of its racial specificity, of its blackness, its biracialness, its specific position within the American racial hierarchy, and converts it into undifferentiated material that can be inserted into a white character's narrative without alteration. The body on screen is Zendaya's body, a body that is visibly not white, that carries the markers of racial difference that any viewer can perceive. But the character that inhabits the body is written as white, a character whose history, whose psychology, whose relationship to violence and radicalization and forgiveness is structured by whiteness, and makes sense only within a white framework. The gap between the body and the character, between the flesh that the audience sees and the narrative that the flesh is made to carry, is the gap that Spillers identified as the foundational violence of American racial grammar. The body is black, the narrative is white, and the film does not acknowledge the gap, does not engage with the gap, does not even perceive the gap as a gap. It simply proceeds as if the body and the narrative are naturally aligned, as if a black body can carry a white story without distortion, as if racial identity is a surface feature that can be changed without altering the substance beneath. This is the logic of colorblindness, the ideology that treats racial identity as irrelevant, as a cosmetic difference that does not affect the fundamental structures of experience. And colorblindness, as the critical race theorists from Crenshaw to Benilla Silva to Ian Haney Lopez have demonstrated, is not the absence of racism. It is the most sophisticated form of racism. The form that operates not through exclusion but through inclusion, not through the denial of access but through the denial of specificity, not through the refusal to see black people but through the refusal to see their blackness as constitutive of their experience. The Letterboxd review that identifies Rachel as a figure of weaponized white femininity opens an analytical dimension that demands extended engagement because it connects the film's racial architecture to the specific dynamics of interracial female relationships. Dynamics that have been theorized by scholars from Bell Hooks to Patricia Hill Collins to Shirley Ann Tate, and that operate in the drama with a precision that the film itself does not acknowledge, but that the transcript makes available for analysis. Rachel's hostility toward Emma escalates throughout the film in ways that exceed any proportional response to the confession. Rachel fires Emma from a professional collaboration. Rachel calls the night before the wedding to say she won't attend. Rachel delivers a speech loaded with hostile subtext. Rachel tells Misha about the shooting. Rachel, in the review's formulation, has been waiting for a socially acceptable reason to act on the resentment that she has accumulated through years of proximity to Emma's beauty, Emma's desirability, Emma's capacity to command rooms and attention in ways that Rachel cannot. The confession is the permission structure. It authorizes Rachel's destruction of Emma under the cover of moral principle, converting what is actually a racialized power play, a white woman's resentment of a black woman's desirability, into a righteous act of moral accountability. Tate's scholarship on black women's desirability is directly relevant here. Tate argues that black women's desirability operates as a site of both fetishization and threat within white-dominated social spaces, that black women's beauty is simultaneously desired and feared, simultaneously pursued and punished, simultaneously visible and invisible. Emma's beauty, Zendaya's beauty, is the film's most potent visual element, and it functions within the narrative as both an asset and a liability. It is what draws Charlie to her in the coffee shop. It is what makes the meet cute possible, what sustains the relationship, what makes the wedding a plausible event, but it is also what makes Rachel's resentment possible, because Emma's beauty is not merely personal, it is political. In a social space organized by racial hierarchy, a black woman's beauty challenges the monopoly on desirability that white femininity has historically claimed, the monopoly that Cheryl Harris identified as one of the property interests in whiteness, the material and psychological advantages that accrue to those whose bodies conform to white beauty standards. Emma's beauty does not conform to white beauty standards. It transcends them. It renders them irrelevant. And this transcendence, this capacity to be desirable without being white, to command attention without performing whiteness, to be beautiful on terms that the white beauty apparatus does not control, is the threat that Rachel responds to, consciously or not, when she seizes on Emma's confession as the justification for her destruction. The Roger Ebert review, written by Robert Daniels, provides the most precisely articulated critical reading of this dynamic. Daniels notes that Zendaya intuitively understands how perceptions about black women can drastically alter how they're viewed, particularly by white women when they're perceived as violent. The phrase particularly by white women is doing enormous analytical work in that sentence because it identifies the specific interracial dynamic that the film depicts but refuses to name. The dynamic in which white women's perception of black women as violent activates a specific set of racialized fears. Fears rooted in the historical construction of black femininity as threatening, as unfeminine, as capable of a physicality and an aggression that violates the norms of genteel womanhood that white femininity has historically defined itself against. When Emma confesses to planning a school shooting, she does not merely confess to violence. She confesses to a kind of violence that confirms white femininity's deepest fears about black femininity. The fear that behind the warmth, behind the charm, behind the smile, there is a